If you've ever caught one of my live streams, you know I like to end every live stream with a game in the Tier 7 tech tree French cruiser, the Charles Martel. And this Friday, if you've never caught one of my live streams, I will of course be streaming at the usual time. I stream every Friday around about 11 a.m. to noon Eastern Time, sometimes later in the day. Like the Friday following this upcoming Friday, I'll be streaming later. And both times I stream, I'll end with the Charles Martel. Now, when I do this, I sometimes get the question, why do you always play your last game in the Charles Martel? And I thought, well, I'll make a video out of it because this particular match you see beginning in front of you occurred on one of my more recent streams, and we end it with about 3000 XP. Not necessarily an unusual occurrence for me in the Charles Martel. But the reason why I like to play it every game does require a little bit of background explanation. I, of course, have been playing World of Warships Legends almost since the beginning. I picked it up just a few months after the game got out of its beta testing phase and went live. And back in the day, back in the good old days when our friend T-Bull was still making videos, and before I had become a CC, a Tier 5 premium French cruiser was released by the name of DeGrasse. I watched T-Bull's review of that ship and instantly bought it as my first ever paid premium in this game. The DeGrasse was at one time my very favorite ship, and there are good reasons for that. It was a pretty good DPM machine at Tier 5. It's a little bit better now, following the buff to high explosive shells in this game, where the peculiar -1 penetration rule was removed. Massively benefited all Tier 5 cruisers, the DeGrasse included. But anyway, the DeGrasse used to be my favorite ship, and it's a very fast, very agile little cruiser at Tier 5 that has 152mm guns. They reload rather quickly, and it's very good at starting fires. The Charles Martel is essentially the spiritual successor to the DeGrasse. They have a lot of similarities. Both of them are quite fast for their tiers. They each have 9 guns with almost a similar reload time, actually. The DeGrasse is about 8 seconds, and so is the Charles Martel. But the Charles Martel has both more armor than the DeGrasse, more HP, and finally, the guns are bigger. DeGrasse only has 152mm guns. These are 203s, but they have a reload time more comparable to light cruisers. And that right there is really the reason I enjoy playing the Charles Martel so much. I'm not under any illusions that it's the best Tier 7 cruiser in the game. It's definitely not, but if we're ranking cruisers in tiers, there are a couple S-tier cruisers at Tier 7. One of them might be, for example, the Plymouth, but I would place the Charles Martel squarely in the A tier, just below the S. It's very, very strong, and has been since its release, although I feel like it's a rather overlooked cruiser. Its strength comes primarily from its speed, its ability to maneuver, the long range of its guns, and their rapid reload. These guns can range out to over 17 kilometers with André Lemonnier at the helm as the commander, and they reload when you use the reload module in about 8 seconds. But as you can see, I fitted the Epic Reload mod to the Charles Martel, so with every 30,000 damage we do, our reload improves until it's below 8 seconds. In fact, right now, I think it's sitting in the upper 7 seconds. So that means our DPM is actually quite scary. These HE shells can, of course, penetrate over 32mm of armor, being 203mm shells. So they can pen a lot of battleships in a lot of places and do, the standard HE penetration damage. Plus, the fire chance is really, really good. And that's to say nothing of the AP. The AP is no slouch. You can see we've already gotten some Citadels in this match, and I think we got them against that Hipper a little bit earlier when he was out there fairly far away. The Charles Martel's AP is, of course, French, and as you may or may not know, the French generally have some of the best AP penetration characteristics in the game, whether we're talking about battleships, cruisers, or French destroyers. All of them have better penetration relative to the other nations' ships. The only time they really get beat out are by things like the Russians. So Charles Martel's AP is highly effective against other cruisers, even at long ranges. It can citadel them all the way across the map. And now you've got the option to use, instead of the sonar consumable, the main battery reload. So if you do get a broadside from maybe something like in Edinburgh, 13 kilometers away, you can pop the reload booster and try to take advantage of that with the pretty good armor piercing. Do we actually get to take advantage of that, though? Looks like we were maybe a little bit late. The Edinburgh has turned away, so bit of a wasted reload booster. Charles Martel, of course, is also fast. It comes with the French engine boost, so can get around 40 knot speed. And the rudder shift, while I don't necessarily have it completely spec'd for that, is fast enough to be dodging a lot of shells. So this is kind of a medium to long range, sort of agile cruiser whose job is primarily to deal damage. And that's really what the cruiser class is sort of all about. As a class, cruisers, I think, are the most diverse in the game. There's a lot of variance when it comes to cruiser performance. You get things, for example, like the Atlanta at Tier 6. Tons of guns, absolutely no armor, no HP, but really rapid-fire destroyer caliber guns, and radar. Its job is sort of like a utility and DD sinking machine. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got higher tier ships like the Azuma or the Yoshino, Siegfried, Aegir, Kronstadt, Alaska. These are all really heavy cruisers with a lot of HP, robust armor that can bounce battleship caliber shells in many cases, and in some cases, with the ships that I just mentioned, battleship caliber guns that take a long time to reload. That right there sort of gives you the flavor of the diversity of the cruiser class. And then you've got a ton of other cruisers, heavy cruisers, like this. And by the way, the heavy cruiser moniker is given due to the gun size of the cruiser, not really anything to do with the armor. The Charles Martel has 203mm guns, or 8-inch guns, so therefore it is designated a heavy cruiser, whereas something like the San Diego at Tier 7 has 127mm guns and therefore is designated as a light cruiser. But there are plenty of heavy cruisers like the Charles Martel with 203mm guns that can do a lot of damage, but not most of them have reloads this quick. The only ones that are sort of comparable, you see our reload is still around 8 seconds actually, even with the Epic Reload mod procced twice, but our reload is around 8 seconds. Most of these heavy cruisers have like a 10, 11 second reload time on this gun size. There are exceptions like the Wichita, for example, which has a very quick reload, or perhaps the Tulsa. And Charles Martel sort of falls in that same area. It's a rapid, high DPM cruiser. Its job is primarily to provide artillery support. Of course, battleships, when they go out in games, are going to be fighting each other or trying to shoot at other cruisers, and your job in the Charles Martel is to apply damage to those battleships and those other cruisers, and of course to shoot at the destroyers whenever you see them, preferably fairly close up and with the use of the reload booster so that you can take them out quite quickly. By the way, here's a taste of the Charles Martel's AP against the broadside of a Champagne, not a very heavily armored battleship at all. And, well, actually, we're not going to get a good example of that as he angles in. We're going to have to switch back to the HE, but we may, in fact, be able to take him out. Note that we have the high caliber medal, and we've done just over 100,000 damage. There's about 5 minutes left to go in this game, and the teams are fairly evenly matched until this Champagne goes down for our very first kill. Now it's 5 versus 3, and the enemy team is looking less good. We've got 2 caps taken. Charlie is open. Doesn't matter. We can go and sink the Hipper, hopefully the other destroyer, and then finally the aircraft carrier. Although they did take down one of our ships, so it's 4 versus 3 now. Although I doubt the Hipper stands any real chance against the onslaught here. But this is primarily why I play the Charles Martel. All of these characteristics that I've been talking about thus far add up to make this ship a very effective DPM machine at Tier 7. And effective DPM machines are good for getting good, high damage, consistent games, sometimes with a lot of impact, sometimes not. Damage isn't all there is when it comes to battle impact. You can do a lot of damage in a cruiser like a Charles Martel, something that's good, for example, at starting fires. You can easily rack up damage quite quickly because fire damage does a lot of damage to battleships in particular. And so you can see those numbers climb high in a short amount of time, but sometimes that doesn't matter if that damage isn't being converted into kills either by you or by your teammates. You can get 200k damage, sink nothing, and then lose the game. But sometimes that rapid DPM and high pressure from the HE or even the AP can deal a lot of damage and apply a lot of pressure to the enemy team and cause them to lose. And even if it doesn't cause them to lose, even if you can't make the win with a high DPM machine like the Charles Martel, which you can't always. This is, of course, a team game, and you do need the participation of your teammates in order to win pretty much every time. If they all, fold and sink instantly in the match, you're obviously going to lose, and it's going to be a blowout. But the Charles Martel can handle it a lot of times. Or if it can't, it can at least deal a lot of damage and get pretty impressive XP numbers. We're going to end this game with a fair amount of damage, not the most you've ever seen, but we are going to get about 3,000 XP, and that comes down to our applying our damage so much to a lot of these ships, and plus getting the assist ribbon on one of the capture circles. So that's why I play the Charles Martel at the end of every stream, because it's a high DPM machine that enjoys a lot of consistency with its HE power and a lot of punching power with its AP. We might have been able to see it there had the island not blocked our shells and turned them into ghost shells against the Hipper. But it's just the Hipper and the aircraft carrier left, and the aircraft carrier is out there spotted broadside to us, so he's essentially a nice damage pinata. But the Hipper can actually shoot back, so before we push out here and try to get the CV, we want to take care of the Hipper and be extra careful not to show him broadside. The Hipper's AP, especially when it comes to fighting other heavy cruisers, is no joke. Charles Martel, though, is interesting. It does have a bit of that French black hole armor going on. There's a space between the armor plating that sometimes absorbs AP shells and prevents citadels. I think you actually saw that in action there. The Hipper did chunk us, but it was only about 6 or 7k that he did. Definitely not a citadel. At least I don't think so. Maybe it was a citadel, but it wasn't enough to take us out, and the Hipper went down. So it's just the enemy CV that we can farm now. We're at 120,000 damage. I think we're going to get about 20k more off of this CV, and we're going to end up with around 140k and 3,000 XP when this game ends. So anyway, the Charles Martel, very consistent DPM machine at the tier, good for getting high damage games, good for getting fires, and good for getting quite a bit of XP. I highly recommend grinding to it if you haven't, because while a lot of people overlook this cruiser, after all, it doesn't have the utility of, say, the American cruisers, doesn't have a radar, and if you use the reload booster, then you don't even have sonar to spot torpedoes for yourself and teammates. So it's really not about utility in the way some other cruisers are, it's much more about pumping out good amounts of damage. And that's why I end every stream with it, because it's consistent and it can get high damage games with good XP numbers. So I highly recommend grinding to it, and if you do, you might be thinking the San Luis at tier 8 is a great successor to the Charles Martel. It's not. I really wouldn't recommend grinding up to that one. I think if you've got the Charles Martel, there's really no reason to proceed on the tech tree line. The only reason you would want to play the San Luis is if it was a requirement in order to get the Henri. But we don't have the Henri in-game, so the Charles Martel really is the pinnacle of French cruiser power at the moment. Hope you enjoyed the video. If so, give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.